Today, we're stepping into one of the most consequential legal and constitutional debates of our time. Is the U.S. president above the law? And with this is director Michael Kirk, an award winning filmmaker and founding producer of Frontline. His latest documentary, Trump's Power and the Rule of Law, explores how the idea that no one is above the law is being tested like never before in the courts, in Congress, and in the Oval Office itself. So, through interviews and historical analysis, the film asks what happens to democracy when executive power goes unchecked. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You spent decades reporting on American power, from the White House to the Pentagon to Congress. You followed how institutions, function and fail. When did you realize that Trump's presidency was pushing the presidency itself into new and perhaps dangerous territory?
We covered him, in his first term. He's the fifth or sixth president, depends on how you count him, that I've been covering. And in the first term, he was just like completely kind of lost. Didn't feel like there was any coherence. There was no strategy, no big idea. In this one, basically from the very beginning, that night in Washington where he goes into the arena and he's throwing pens and signing executive orders. I thought to myself, this is something different. This feels coherent. Then he goes back to the Oval Office and he signs the pardons for 1,500 people who had attacked the Capitol building during January 6th. And I thought, well, this is not just a staged thing. He's got an idea going here. We've, as I say, covered him plenty and covered many presidents. We always can kind of get inside, so we figured it out. What is he doing? Is this, Steve Bannon called it days of thunder? Is it just noise, or is there something going on here that we should pay attention to? And it didn't take very long before we realized there was a big film that needed to be made, a big story that needed to be told to the American people about 6 months out about what was he doing, and was it just noise and chaos, and fear and anger and revenge and all the words that have been applied, or was it those things and something else? And it's the something else that this film's about.
Right, and then the title puts the power and the rule of law in tension.
Yeah,
There are maybe two different forces there. You don't always pull in the same direction sometimes. You
right.
know, if you want to talk about what does your film say about what happens when personal power begins to sort of overpower the legal boundaries?
It's been an argument that's been going on in America since the very beginning. Alexander Hamilton said, "I want a very strong executive. I want the executive to have all the power, and the Congress and the courts, they can keep things going, but the president's going to have to drive it. It's going to take real leadership." Whether he was thinking of George Washington or not, I don't know. He may not have been thinking about Donald Trump if he would have laid the example before him, but he might have been. He might have said, listen, if 70 million or 75 million Americans vote for the president of the United States, he's got a mandate. If the Supreme Court has given him a decision last summer, which is essentially the greatest decision ever given a president, which is you have absolute immunity from doing anything as president of the United States, that's rocket fuel to a guy like Donald Trump, who likes to operate out in the open, unlike Lyndon Johnson or somebody who break heads and knock heads and break kneecaps privately. This is a guy who's right out. He's out there all in the wide open. And every president has wanted to expand their power. Every president has done everything they could to connive and cajole and threaten and do whatever they have to do to get the Congress to get out of the way. They've appointed judges that they hope will support whatever they want to do. That's an ongoing part of the democracy, and it functions. And in some ways, even during the chaos of the early 6 months of Trump, the courts have, the federal courts, hundreds of cases against the president, saying no. A lot of the immigration cases, no. The courts, judges appointed by Obama, by Reagan, by Trump himself, by Bush, by everybody, they sort of without ideology have found in favor of or against the president of the United States. But this guy and the people around him are really determined this time to go out and test it as far as it can go. and that means they're heading for the United States Supreme Court. And as we've seen in the last week or two, in some ways, the Supreme Court is sending back down to the lower courts adjustments that say, hey, you can't, wait a minute, you can't constrain a president from firing the people who work for him, for example. That's most of the people in the government. You can't stop him from doing this and that and this and that. But when it comes to the rubber meets the road phrase, due process, do you have the right, do I have the right to face my accuser and say, here's my excuse for what you think I did, or I wasn't there, or it's not me, or I'm not a gang member. I don't have a record in Salvador or Venezuela or Mexico. You got the wrong guy. That's the moment that everybody who's watching, everybody on every side, we talk to conservative judges, we talk to liberal judges, we talk to all kinds of people. That's the moment they're all headed for, is when, if that gets to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says, well, we like you, we're conservatives, and you're John Roberts. I know I gave you an immunity thing, but Mr. President, I got to say you're going too far here, either on due process or something else like it. You got to obey this court order that says bring them back, or whatever it is. When that moment comes, that's when people tell us the constitutional crisis will be at hand, because Trump Trump's people say he will not blink at that moment. Steve Bannon tells us in the film he will not blink. He will not, in other words, do what the Supreme Court tells him to do. And if that's the case, then we're at that showdown moment where the democracy, our belief in the rule of law, is really in peril.
Right. Now you talk about the word constitutional crisis. You give context. You talk about Watergate, Nixon, and you see the films when they were calling that time a constitutional crisis. And you
Right.
sort of answered this question already, Michael. But do you think the U.S. has crossed into that sort of constitutional crisis during Trump's term, or are we like, still edging towards one?
Yeah, the people we talk to, very conservative, former appeals court justice Michael Ludig, for example, said, we're on the way. It seems almost inevitable because the judges, he said to us, will not back down. They can't. They don't have an army, but they have the law. And if they feel that this is against the law, they have an obligation uh, uh, to act, to do whatever that means, the right thing, enforce the law. And the president, if he thinks the law is not important, not something that gets in, if he thinks it's something that gets in the way of his power, his ability to do what he wants to do. And in the case of immigration, for example, if that's where we land, it's he feels that he's picked immigration intentionally. He knows that that's the big issue. A lot of Americans who voted for him, they believe what he says about immigration and about migrants and about all the phrases he uses: murderers, rapists, gang members. He's made it an issue that he can use to test this exact moment. And do I think we're in the crisis? We're the people we talked to said we're crawling toward it. Everybody's watching the Justice Roberts and the Supreme Court. What are they doing? What are they saying? There's cases right below in the appeals court level. There's one important case that's just frozen for 2 months. That could be the case if they ever open that one up. That's the Judge Boasberg case about sending the Venezuelan so-called gang members to El Salvador in the middle of the night. That case is the one that's been sort of frozen, shockingly, by the appeals court, waiting for something. Who knows what it is? But whatever it is potentially going to bring us to that crisis. So, are we there? Probably not. Are we headed there? Probably.
Yeah, and like I said, the film opens up with history, Nixon, Watergate, and you mentioned all those. As a filmmaker, why was it important to ground the story in past presidencies, and how does it really help us understand what's different now between, let's say, what happened with Watergate?
Yeah. Why did Richard Nixon perhaps the the closest thing in terms of how people felt about him. I mean, I'm old enough that I was around for Nixon, and it was among the first things I was. I wasn't reporting on that, but I was a reporter and a producer. I was learning about things by watching what was happening during Watergate, and you had a real division in the society between people who loved Nixon and people who hated him, who were afraid of him. You had Vietnam, you had young people going off to war, you had all the things that were happening in the society. And Richard Nixon, who firmly believed that he could do, he had a huge mandate in the election in '72, that he could do kind of whatever he wanted to do. So it's in that sense very close to what Trump thinks and what the Trump people believe. He was an idol for an awful lot of Republicans who were kids then and growing up to become people who would go into the Justice Department. People would become lawyers. People would go into politics. Nixon was the the first since Franklin Roosevelt, the first American president who kind of did what he wanted to do, feeling that he had a mandate, and he probably did. Whether it was a mandate to do wrong is a completely different issue, and he was doing wrong. And by breaking the law, and then the court, this moment that I'm talking about is in our future, the court came forward to Nixon and said, I'm sorry, you've got to give those tapes up that you have, that they're evidence and we need them. And Nixon, they were recordings of Nixon in the Oval Office, and Nixon didn't want to do it. Thought, okay, I'm going to defy the court. And it was the Republicans, many Republicans in the Senate who drove over Barry Goldwater and others, who came over to Nixon and said, you got to do it or America falls apart. So that's the first instance. We had to start there to say America's been at this precipice before. Nobody's saying Trump has done anything illegal. Who really knows about that yet? But what he is doing is pushing the boundaries as far as possible. And if the court actually says you've gone too far here, in whatever case it is, if you've gone too far, Mr. President, you're out of your lane. You've got to step back and bring those people home or do whatever relief would be. Uh, the real question is, if Trump is defying, is there an equivalent to Barry Goldwater and the other Republican senators in the United States Senate who came over to Nixon at the White House one night and said, you will ruin the Republican Party and the democracy forever if you do this. Don't do it. And Nixon, it hurt him. He really wanted to fight, but he understood that his place in history and the Republican Party's survival depended on it. Now, are there people? The question is, are there people in the United States Senate who have that kind of power and control, or power of persuasion with Donald Trump? I don't know. The moment hopefully will never come when somebody has to come over and say something to him about it. But that's really why we did Nixon, was to show this is the full arc. And here we are again, 50 years later. Here we are again, or headed to a moment like that.
Yeah. Michael, I know I'm running out of time with you here, but I just two more questions if I can. You call this, the film calls this, like a sort of a dangerous moment in time. In the film, we hear warnings from like legal scholars and public servants. What worries you most about what's happening right now, and what gives you hope?
We're so divided as a country. I mean, I think the thing is that what the experts tell us in the film is, don't count on the court, don't count on the Congress, count on people. If people don't want this to happen, and if there's a vibrant and free and robust information system telling people things like our film, just here's what's up, folks. Decide for yourself. Uh, uh, what I worry about is that we're so divided and we're getting our information from so many crazy different kinds of places. It's not surprising that many Americans are ill-informed or misinformed or believing in conspiracies or hating the other side at such a level of intensity that maybe a really important dialogue like the one we're trying to start with this film may not be possible. And that would be extremely disappointing and I think dangerous because it's really going to. There's a midterm election coming. Can the Democrats get it together and have viable candidates? Can people decide? Well, the only way that we can rein in what feels like an overreach, if it feels like that to the American people, is by having Democrats at least in one house of the Congress, so that they fight back and and the laws don't just get kind of snowballed. Those are the things that worry me, that we're frozen kind of in place as a democracy in this fight amongst ourselves, and we're not paying the kind of attention that it would take, whatever that is. I don't know what it is. I'm not a political leader, but can people get together? Can they march? Can they? I don't know what. Can they? Elect Democrats or libertarians or whoever it is that's going to get involved in the process. Can young people feel like, it's worth fighting for? I'm gonna test this. I think it's going too far, or maybe not. I mean, I don't know. Bannon and those guys believe this is democracy in action. What Trump is doing is democracy in action. It's not a constitutional crisis. The president is acting like a president, and he gets to do that. And it's the Congress, or it's the court that's not being democratic. They're going to just Judges are just issuing orders. That's not democratic. So you can see what the fight is about, and it's a big fight, and it may be the most important fight we've had in America in a long, long time.
Yeah, that's a good place to end it there. Well, thank you so much. We're talking to Michael Kirk by his latest documentary, Trump's Power and the Rule of Law on PBS. Thank you so much for joining me. I do really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great questions. Thank you very much.